the valley by Westfield, it was raining, but by the time we went up to the heights of Berkeley, it was snowing. Fortunately, I wasn't driving, and we made it safely home. But again, thank you. I'd like to say a few words about John Andre, someone who I'm sure you all know, but possibly I might be able to stump one or two of you, and we'll see how that goes. Major John Andre has long occupied an unusual position in Revolutionary history. Linked to the traitorous General Benedict Arnold, Andre was caught on September 23, 1780 in Westchester, New York, wearing civilian clothes and carrying the plans for West Point. Spies deserved no mercy or sympathy when captured. They engaged in an underhanded war of concealment that real soldiers disdained to fight. Yet many American officers found themselves drawn to the captured major. Andre was, after all, a man of parts, a poet, playwright, and amateur artist, comfortable with both pen and sword. As Alexander Hamilton noted, Andre's, quote, sentiments were elevated and inspired esteem. They had a softness that conciliated affection. His elocution was handsome, his address easy, polite, and insinuating. If the British could have exchanged Arnold for the imprisoned Andre, everyone, except Arnold, would have been satisfied. Yeah. But it was not to be. A smiling Andre walked to his execution in Chap, New York on October 2nd, 1780, exchanging salutations and praising the drum and fife music as the death march played. Andre did pause upon seeing the hangman's rope. An American officer noted the hesitation, upon which Andre replied, "I am reconciled to my death, but not to the mode." Andre had hoped for a firing squad. Andre's last words were, when asked, "Only this, gentlemen, that you all bear me witness that I meet my fate like a brave man." Thousands watched the hanging. Afterwards, a Continental soldier wrote, "Such fortitude I never was witness of, nor ever had I such disagreeable feeling at an execution to see a man go out of time without fear, but all the time smiling, is a matter I could not conceive of." Another Continental officer said, "He died like a Roman." Many onlookers wept. Andre's burial by the execution site in Tappan, New York, in Rockland County, should have closed the episode. Yet, Major John Andre remained indelibly imprinted on the public memory, contoured by issues of class and patriotism. That Andre was remembered is not perhaps surprising. The Arnold link, I think, explains that. But how Andre should be commemorated, that was more troublesome. Was he a genteel, brave adversary, or an underhanded spy meriting scorn? That answer proved difficult, and different generations and classes of Americans have responded in their own very distinct manner. Now, let me flash forward a bit. Andre is dead at 1780. Evidence of how different Americans looked at Andre can be seen in 1817 when John Paulding, does anyone remember John Paulding? Now you're starting to remind me of my graduate students. I rarely get to stump the sons of the American Revolution. John Paulding was one of the three men who had caught Andre. Paulding petitioned Congress for a larger pension. He had originally been awarded one of $200 a year in 1789. I believe it was something like, I think that was something like 10 or 20% of all the pension money paid out. The government did not pay out pension money much then. Paulding had gotten quite a bit. But he wanted more. After all, when you marry 3 times and have over 11 children, you need money. Paulding, Isaac Van Wart, and David Williams were the 3 irregular militiamen who caught Andre in the neutral ground, that area in Westchester between the Continental and British Army where raiders and spies held sway. The 3 men had received $200 annual pensions and medals from a grateful Congress in 1780. Washington gave a dinner for them in which he presented the medals. And 1805 history labeled the men heroes. Now, however, Paulding's 1817 request before Congress encountered opposition. Congressman Benjamin Talmadge of Connecticut, one of Andre's jailers, proclaimed the 3 men mercenaries of uncertain loyalties. Major Andre's stories about the 3 captors convinced Talmadge that greed, not patriotism, had inspired the 3. If Andre had money, Talmadge believed, the 3 men would have released him. That the three men claimed Andre's horse, saddle, and watches, the spoils of war, probably did not sit well with Talmadge either. The upshot of this congressional brouhaha, Paulding never got an increase on his pension, just kept the $200 a year. The issue of Andre's captors emerged as a cause célèbre over the next few years. The three men had occupied an honored footnote in American history, touted as virtuous yeomen. Now their reputations were besmirched. An irate David Van Wart traveled from Westchester to New York City with a letter from his minister, attesting to his character. Paulding filed a deposition in New York City, asking for similar vindication. Williams resided quietly in Schoharie County, New York, avoiding the general hubbub. Former associates of the three men later put in their judgment. One, John Yerkes, a Westchester neighbor and irregular militiaman, related in 1845 his belief that Paulding and his companions had, quote, misrepresented the affair to Congress and the public authority. Yerkes and three others had split from Paulding and company to watch another road, agreeing to divide any plunder they might have found. No division of plunder occurred, embittering Yerkes. Another neighbor, Nathaniel Biles, noted that Van Wart refused to talk about Andre's captures because of, quote, of what Paulding said in his cups. We don't know what a drunken Paulding said, but we do know from another neighbor of Van Wart that Van Wart supposedly wanted to release Andre because he, quote, knew he would be executed. And these are stories that came out later when they filed other accounts of the war, and this is what the neighbors actually thought. Nevertheless, Paulding and company did receive a measure of vindication. All three had a rare honor granted them. A private sculptor made life masks of all of them. This is very rare for ordinary militiamen, small farmers to have a life mask and then a bust made of them. And I believe if you go to Cooperstown, New York, you can actually see three busts of Paulding, Van Wart, and Williams, Andre's captors, in good company with the likes of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the Marquis de Lafayette. Again, very rare to see irregular militiamen get life masks and then busts made out of them. Indeed, they're the only commoners to be enshrined, I would say, in the pantheon of American heroes. In Ohio, patriotic legislators created Van Wart County in 1820 in the western part of the state, soon to be home to the city of Van Wart. Both names were misspelled, by the way. Wart, Van Wart was spelled as V-A-N-W-E-R-T. It's V-A-N-W-A-R-T. In Georgia, Paulding County, carved out of former Cherokee territory, appeared along with Van Wart, the county seat, also misspelled in 1838. And a Williams Academy soon appeared in the town as well. So the captors do have a measure of vindication. Yet Major John Andre generated more attention. He becomes the sentimental spy, the honorable adversary of genteel parts, regrettably executed by the laws of war. A 1798 play by William Dunlop entitled Andre, one of the first historical dramas based upon revolutionary figures, won warm applause from Manhattan audiences, despite a short run due to indifferent acting. The three captors do not even appear in the play. They're not seen as worthy captors. A painting by Thomas Sully, The Capture of Major Andre, was widely exhibited and later engraved. Although the three captors were depicted, Andre, the central figure, holds the viewer's attention. The Andre cult prompted Timothy Dwight, president of Yale in 1811, to ponder the outpouring of sympathy. In his words, perhaps no person in like circumstance was ever more lamented by those whose prime interest he had attempted to destroy. It is rather interesting. You memorialize, you give sentiment to a spy who was actually there to destroy your entire cause. So why should you be sympathetic to him? Timothy Dwight could not understand it. In 1821, Andre again overshadowed his captors. James Buchanan, British consul to New York City, sailed up the Hudson River in a British warship to reclaim the Major's remains for their memorial in Westminster Abbey. Andre had a memorial there, now the British wanted the bones. New York Governor DeWitt Clinton gave his blessing to the venture. However, according to John Pintard, a prominent New York City patrician and amateur historian, the event excited an overboiling patriotism among the citizenry, who deemed themselves, in his words, the exclusive guardians of the public weal. laboring class New Yorkers threatened mob actions against the British consul. The New York Evening Post, which was there even then, reported the removal of the bones inspired different sentiments by different editors, with friends and enemies strident in their contrasting viewpoints. Once in Tappan, the British consul, Buchanan, faced an angry mob opposed to the disinterment, claiming it was an insult to the memory of George Washington. How can you dig up these bones? You're insulting Washington's memory. Buchanan's solution? Treating them to a round of drinks in the local tavern. In New York City, large crowds of people filed past the coffin containing Andre's remains, showering flowers and garlands upon it. Respectable citizens, it seems, wanted to honor a brave adversary. Laboring class citizens thought the proceedings unwarranted. Well, with Andre safely secured in Westminster Abbey, the Andre cult should have slowly petered out. The three captors, Paulding, Van Wart, and Williams, were all dead by the 1830s. Nonetheless, they did receive imposing monuments, memorials. They did have a certain degree of memory. In 1853, Tarrytown, New York, the site of Andre's capture, finally unveiled a monument to the three men after 2 decades of stalled attempts. Many onlookers thought the statue atop it a fine likeness of Paulding. Andre had been seemingly eclipsed. Yet history has a way of repeating, or perhaps more accurately, reconfiguring itself, particularly when a new generation comes of age. In Gilded Age New York in the 1870s and 80s, a new generation did come of age, especially in the person of American millionaire Cyrus R. Field. I don't know what Cyrus R. Field is famous for. I never knew until I started to look at this. He was clearly famous, but I didn't know that. I had to find out, well, what was he famous for? Transatlantic cable. He was the man who finally put one in. And then, of course, he became very wealthy and did other things. And what is Cyrus R. Field planning to do? He's planning a John Andre monument in Tappan, New York. Constructing a monument to Andre challenged the thinking behind commemorative markers. Such memorials, after all, supply the visible focal point of the historical past. The sites are places where past and present meet. Home to dedication ceremonies, orations, and parades. Civic rituals that define the symbolic intent of the stone. But that works best when the official public culture agrees upon the individual or event commemorated. To honor a former enemy, an executed spy no less, who courageously gave his life not in defense of the national interest, but in fierce and conniving opposition, appears a naive gesture at best and foolhardy at worst. As the promoter of the transatlantic cable, Cyrus R. Field had won acclaim in both the U.S. and Britain as, and this surprised me, the Columbus of our times, it was called. Parlaying his fame into wealth, an 1878 visit by Arthur Stanley, Dean to Westminster Abbey, inspired Field to buy the Tappan execution site. This perhaps makes sense. Field had pro-British leanings, British capital had invested in some of his ventures, he acquired large sections of Manhattan's elevated roadway. In all likelihood, Field wanted to make a sporting gesture to the Dean of Westminster Abbey. So why not buy the property and employ Arthur Stanley to write a suitable inscription for the monument? It all seems so easy. Things went wrong from the beginning. First, the farmer owning the land refused to sell. Field forced him out by buying the mortgage which he had neglected to pay interest on. Locals did not like this and thought it quite unfair. The monument itself, unveiled on October 2nd, 1879, drew very few local Tappan residents. Part of the verse, written by Dean Stanley, read, "Here died October 2nd, 1780, Major John Andre of the British Army, who entering the American lines on a secret mission to Benedict Arnold for the surrender of West Point, was taken prisoner, tried, condemned as a spy. His death, though according to the stern code of war, moved even his enemies to pity, and both armies mourned the fate of one so young and brave." One of the ending lines expressed Anglo-American solidarity, one in race, in language, and in religion, in the hope that the friendly understanding will never be broken. Well, Field might have thought this a nice inscription, but criticism immediately arose. Major A. B. Gardner, late law professor at West Point, complained that the inscription should have stated Andre was on a treacherous mission, intending to massacre the poor, ragged Continentals. He added with sarcasm, "What I want to see now is a monument to Benedict Arnold." The New York Times wondered if Field would next propose a stone to Arnold, while the New York Post commented that some thought the proceedings by Field rather eccentric. A letter writer to the New York Sun urged all patriots to contribute to a fund to erect a brick wall around the Andre stone. One local Tappan resident, brother to the evicted farmer, the man who lost his farm due to Field, declared ominously, "Something may happen to the monument." Indignation against the Field Monument, as the New York Times described it, slowly mounted and exploded into outright vandalism in 1882. On February 23rd, that's the day right after, February 23rd, Washington's birthday, the timing I think is delivered. A well-dressed stranger appeared in Tappan and smashed the monument's lettering beyond recognition. Atop the stone he left a small American flag and a bit of verse, part of which read, "This vulgar and insulting stone would honor for all time, not sneaking Arnold's death alone. Not sneaking Andre's death alone, but black Ben Arnold's crime. And they who thus can glorify the traitor and his deeds, themselves high treason would employ, if 'twould fulfill their needs. Americans resolve proclaim that on our own dear land, never while the people reign shall treason's statue stand. And he who does erect it next on fair Columbia's breast, with furtive or with false pretext, shall dangle from its crest." New York City newspapers condemned the destruction, although the New York Herald termed it poetic justice. The Times claimed that the attacker, later identified as George H. Hendrick, a sign painter and New York City socialist, should have known that it was a monument to Field, not Andre. The Times like to always play this. It's not an Andre monument, it's Field and his vanity and such. Attempts by Field to apprehend Hendricks backfired, and Hendricks made good his escape. Well, where did New Yorkers escape to? New Jersey. New Jersey. Such. But he may not have been done. After Field repaired the monument, an attack occurred in March 1882, probably by Hendricks, featuring nitroglycerin, destroying the monument's base. On April 1st, April Fool's Day, unknown individuals, probably the local residents, carted away pieces of the foundation. Fields then embarked on an interesting scheme. He said to himself, I'm sure he's saying, I must change the message of the monument. He proposed constructing a historic Washington Park around the stone, with avenues named after Andre's captors. We'd have a Paulding Street, a Van Wart Street, and a Williams Street, in an attempt to deflect criticism. It never happened. Despite losing much of his fortune in 1884, Fields righted the monument one more time. He surrounded it with a 5-foot spiked iron fence in 1885. At the restoration ceremony, however, a lawyer informed Field, "There will be mischief here, I am afraid, Mr. Field." The prophecy came true on November 3rd, 1885, with a thunderous roar. Windows across Tappan rattled and broke. The noise reverberated across Rockland County and beyond the Hudson River to Westchester. Most of Tappan's male population ran out to see who had done the crime, but found no one. At daybreak, villagers discovered a rope ladder, scattered blocks of stone, and a pulverized foundation blasted by dynamite. Many people pocketed foundation portions over the next few days, which later turned into Andre Monument paperweights across Rockland County towns. Cyrus Field was not done. He marshaled his forces, private detectives. He hired a small group of them, circulating around Rockland and Westchester County. Suspicion centered on Irish immigrants, especially extreme Irish nationalists, one of whom had promised $100 for anyone who blew up the stone. No culprit was ever found. All Field could do was sputter in a New York Telegraph interview in late December 1885 that the spirit of those who blew up my monument to Andre was the spirit of ignorance, the spirit of the communistic dynamiter. Field never righted the toppled stone. Plagued by financial and family troubles, he had little time for monuments. Harper's New Monthly in 1886 thought it would be be better not to rebuild the monument. Andre was too controversial figure to warrant such a memorial. The fallen monument remained in that estate until the town picked up the property in a tax delinquency sale in 1898. Quietly, local town folk righted the stone without publicity. Sentiment toward it had changed. Perhaps some of it was due to America's world power status after the Spanish-American War, along with improved relations with Great Britain. Even the New York Times, which had a tag field over the monument, changed its tune in 1904, noting that if Southerners could have memorials to Robert E. Lee and other Confederates who, quote, erred more, why should Americans object to a monument to a spy? On such terms, Andre merited a memorial. And visitors today who make the trip to Taphans, to a little suburban subsection, can still see the Andre Monument, now peacefully accepted by locals and outsiders, many of them blissfully unaware of the controversy that once surrounded both John Andre the man and Andre the Monument. Thank you. You had mentioned something about an Andre Monument. Has anyone heard of the Andre Monument before? Yeah. Neither had I before I did this. I really hadn't. And in fact, I got started on this. I was doing something else, and I read this story about 1821. They're removing Andre's remains. And I had never realized, oh, he has remains. I guess he does. And there was such a to-do about it. And then I found out, he has a memorial in Westminster Abbey. I never knew. And then I just looked in the New York Times. This was, I think, even almost... No, we did have the internet, and I just looked and I said, there's something called an Andre Monument. This is even stranger than I thought, because clearly you don't have a monument to a spy. Now, if this were Langley, Virginia, and we were all, ex-members of the CIA, we'd have Nathan Hale, and rightly so. But we wouldn't have John Andre. And it really is very strange. Field would constantly say, well, it's not to Andre, but it has his name on it. Well, it's a monument to an event. But he had trouble changing the message and never really succeeded in doing so. And clearly there were elements in the city, whether they were socialist or Irish, who thought it best to pulverize the monument, and they did so on several occasions. But do you have any questions for me at this moment? Yeah.
Is it unique? I mean, is this situation kind of unique, where a British whatever had a monument?
I think so. I mean, let me see if I can recall. I mean, certainly Andre's execution, I believe, was unique. Despite how we may honor Nathan Hale, he had very little press. It's very hard. I think there's maybe one newspaper spy named, Hale hanged. It didn't create any ruckus. There were, I think, something like 9 British spies executed, at least 9 in the American Revolution. But to be frank, I don't know how many of them were. But Andre got the royal treatment in terms of the Arnold connection. I mean, with thousands there, the Americans wanted to put on a good show. But in answer to your question, I really can't think of anything like a monument to this. I mean, we might have a monument to American patriots, some of whom, you'll forgive me, but not everyone remembers Pulaski or DeKalb or some of these other people. But Andre, it's really, yes, it's quite remarkable. Yeah.
Do you know any information about how he got together with Benedict Arnold?
Oh, not as much. I seem to remember there was something about Arnold's wife wanting money and Arnold himself feeling that he had got his wrist slapped. I mean, he did have sort of a reprimand for some things he had done in Philadelphia, using, I think, private wagons to cart his stuff out. I do know that Arnold, according to one account, no one made more money in the Revolution than Arnold. I mean, the British did ante up quite a few thousand pounds, and he did get a commission as, I believe, a British Brigadier General. So, he did quite well in that regard. Whether anyone liked him in the British Army is another story, but yeah, he did well by it. Yeah.
I think Andre used to date Benedict Arnold's wife.
Yeah.
And that's how they connected.
Yeah, I read that too.
I just don't know anymore.
When she went through there in when the British were in Philadelphia, she had an leave on or whatever with Andre.
Maybe that could be.
And she wrote to him even afterwards, so she was in the media.
Yeah.
Nathaniel Hale, he was an officer, is that accurate?
I'm sorry, who?
Nathaniel Hale was an officer, is that accurate, or?
Yes.
Okay, I probably read somewhere that our government's decision to have Major Andre executed was in response to the fact that they had executed.
There's something, there is one account I've read which says that, that someone brought up Hale to Andre, and he said, surely my fate won't be the same. But I've heard other historians say that was sort of like after the fact creation, that this conversation probably didn't take place, but I really don't know. Except to say that there's almost nothing in revolutionary newspapers about Hale. There was an account, I think, in 1781, after Andre was executed, and I think a Massachusetts paper said something about this hubbub about Andre. Hasn't anyone remembered Hale? But they really didn't. And in fact, Hale really doesn't become, I would say, significant until maybe the 1830s and such, and only a few people knew about him.
And he probably never really said, I regret I have but one life to give.
There's some debate too about exactly what he said and where, and what the source of that was, which particular classical source.
I was thinking it's possible more so that the reason why Major Andre was executed was the fact that they didn't catch Benedict Arnold and America had to meet with somebody.
And it was also the laws of war. I mean, Andre's superior, his General Clinton, say, well, he came, Arnold invited him, flag of truce, but he didn't have the flag of truce with him. As I said, he had quitted his uniform. He's in civilian clothes. He's there to get the plans to West Point. This wasn't some sort of polite parley. It really was a spy. And although everyone admired him, and certainly there were these attempts to see about an exchange, there really was no alternative except to execute him. What made it hard, in fact, is that, well, Andre was seen as a gentleman, and you don't execute gentlemen by hanging. It's preferable to be shot. And so, he's being treated like, sort of an ordinary soldier. And so that's supposedly why, he had the momentary hesitation when he saw the wagon and no firing squad. But Andre, I don't know if he still commands quite the interest, but there has been at least one movie made on him, I think with George Sanders and Cornel Wilde.
Scarlet Coat.
The Red Coat? Or the
Scarlet Coat.
The Scarlet Coat. Early 50s, I think? That sound about right? Yeah.
About 51.
So he has had a certain piece. Again, I don't know if he's quite as popular as he used to be.
It was just only a couple of weeks ago.
I missed that. Again, I always get my students because some of them may have heard of Andre. Even that is getting harder and harder for students in the Revolution. They certainly have heard of Arnold, but Andre he's passing out. And Paulding, Van Wart, and Williams, they have the ultimate indignity. There is the monument to the three captors in Tarrytown. But I remember reading a few years ago, and I think it was in the Times, in the travel section, the Times got it wrong. They called it the Andre Monument. It's not supposed to be known that it's the Captors Monument. But in the 19th century, it was often misnamed, and people complained it's the Andre Monument. So again, Andre almost seems to have had the last word, even in a monument designed for the men who fought them.
Did you ever hear of the Culper Ring?
Yes. Oh gosh. Trying to think if there was a Talmage in that. I did, and that's more of a Long Island thing. As I recall, yes. And I do have a book on it somewhere, but I haven't read it in years. Yes.
Okay. And there was one book by Corey somebody that Corey service.
Maybe, but again, I haven't.
I seem to think there's some involvement with Major Andre.
Yeah, there might have been, but I can't recall this, but I do remember.
Yeah, pensions they got, most of the soldiers that got pensions were because they were wounded, right? How many did they actually give out for like honors or things like that?
Well, my percentages might be off, but the 3 men got $200 annual pensions, and I think it was something like 10 or 20% of the total pensions given out. There was a notion, at least right after the revolutions, that if you're patriotic, you don't get a pension. Officers certainly wanted one. This sort of confirms their status as gentlemen, but why did people fight? It wasn't to be rewarded for that. So the three captors were really quite unusual in the fact that they could get pensions. This was long before the 1818 Pension Act, and thus they were quite unique. I'm a little fuzzy about revolutionary officers and their half pay and such, and what sort of rewards were given for them, but they really were quite unique in that regard. I think there were a few people, a few widows, maybe widows of generals who might have gotten a pension from the Congress in the 1780s, but again, small amounts.
Thank you very much for your time spent with us. I'm sure we would like to express our appreciation again.